Greetings, this is Rebecca again for English 102 Online at South Seattle Community College. I hope this podcast finds you well and happy. Today I want to talk a little bit about this idea of sovereignty, but before I do so, I want to give a thumbs up to a particular website, and that is the Sanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now I want to encourage all of you guys to use this website and to make this as the first go-to website for all your research in this class. I like Wikipedia, and I know a lot of students enjoy Wikipedia as well. But Wikipedia really doesn't make for a very good academic resource. And the reason is this. Anybody can write a Wikipedia article, and anyone can go ahead and change a Wikipedia article. And generally, although Wikipedia articles are reviewed by a large work-sourced audience, they are not peer-reviewed. Peer review is when experts in a particular subject review an article that has been written by another author and gives it a seal of approval. The reason we need peer review is because it allows us to make sure we have true academic integrity in our resources and in our information. Wikipedia is a lot of fun, but if you just watch how Wikipedia entries are changed pretty dramatically during election times, you can see how it's also used for propaganda and other forms and uses. So use Wikipedia, but do so only as a place to start for your inspiration. Don't cite it as a resource in this class for discussions or in your papers. However, you can use the Sanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and you can use any article in this particular encyclopedia. It is an amazing resource for you, and it's free. So I want to encourage you to use this more than you use Wikipedia. And that is why, of course, some of our articles for this class is taken from this encyclopedia, because they do such a fantastic job in explaining terms and concepts, giving us some kind of historical context, and also doing a very good job of explaining how present scholars are approaching these ideas. So let me jump to this article we have from the encyclopedia on sovereignty. Now, part of the reason I'm having you read this article is because this concept of sovereignty, first of all, is a rather new concept to the history of mankind. And we'll see how this works when we talk about the article. But also because many of you will be writing papers that deal specifically between a government and its citizens and power plays between these big brother and little brother entities. Key to the idea of sovereignty is whether or not the authority being used is legitimate. And we talked last week about this idea of legitimate authority, and when we looked at Max Weber. And so there is a very important connection between Max Weber, this idea of legitimate supreme authority, which is an idea we'll talk about in relation to sovereignty here, and also the idea of whether or not the big brother and little brother relationship is agreeable. So let's start with the definition first. The author tells us that sovereignty really is supreme authority within a territory. And we have two very specific ideas here: supreme authority and territory. Supreme authority goes back to the idea, as I just said before, legitimate authority. In order to have supreme authority or absolute authority, it has to be legitimate. And the reason is this: if authority that is supreme is not legitimate, then it can be questioned. It can be questioned either by an individual or a group of people. And for authority really to work well, for authority to have what we call logos and also to have this idea of ethos, then the authority must be legitimate. And in order to figure out whether or not the authority you're talking about is legitimate, do go back to Max Weber's idea and apply the ideas, the concepts there, and see if it holds true for your paper's situation. The second element is this idea of territory. Now, the reason why this is a rather new idea is that supreme authority and having a territory did not always exist in the world of the Middle Ages. And our author writes, "This is the quality that early modern states possessed, but which popes, emperors, kings, bishops, and most nobles and vassals during the Middle Age lacked. They did not have supreme authority within a territory. So this is actually a relatively new idea. And this concept of territorialness, that is, where we will have our own nation and we have borders that contain a people, is a rather new idea. Indeed, even the international institutions in today's world, such as the European Union and the United Nations, actually view nationhood in definition of territories. Now we come to the question of where sovereignty and absolute authority resides. Does it reside in the laws of the land, or does it reside in a single individual? Well, Jean Bodin and Thomas Hobbes, two historic philosophers, felt that sovereignty was above the law, and true sovereignty resided in a single individual, such as a king. Under such circumstances, sovereignty that is embodied in a person could be seen as absolute sovereignty. But as the author brings up, we have in today's world both absolute sovereignty and examples of non-absolute sovereignty. So if we understand absolute sovereignty to be a situation where, for example, a king is able to have absolute authority within the territory that he or she rules, then non-absolute sovereignty or non-absolute power of the sovereignty can be seen an example in today's world through the European Union member states. Although the European Union member states can govern their defense, they do not govern their currencies or their trade policies and even many of the social welfare policies. That actually is done in cooperation through the EU authorities and the EU law. It is a collective law rather than individual state or nation laws. And we can see that this is quite an interesting and new development in our history, and right now it's having some troubles as we are seeing the euro fall and member states of the EU start to fight about how they're going to deal with that predicament. Part 2 of this article talks about the rise of the sovereign state in theory and in practice. And it starts in 1648 with the Westphalia, or the Peace of Westphalia, after the 30-year wars, and when states started to develop. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about this. I want you to take some time to read this section of the article yourself. But I want to note that halfway through the article, there is a discussion about Machiavelli and how he observed the politics of the city-states during the Renaissance in Italy, and what he wrote about the city-states and the responsibility of a sovereignty. And I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to very soon be reading a few chapters from The Prince, which is the text that this article is talking about. And I want you to keep that in mind. I also want you to keep in mind Martin Luther and Martin Luther's view, because Martin Luther offered us a view or understanding of sovereignty that the United States has taken to heart, which is that God has his authority, and that is one order of a spirituality or a ruling government, and then humans have their authority, and that they're two separate spheres. That is, that the realm of the spirit is not the same as the realm of the secular or the legal, and legal, that is, hangerings between human beings in sovereign kind of like states. So he kind of even introduces this idea of a separation between church and state, which is quite fascinating in itself. Part 3 is extremely interesting and important to some of you as you write your papers, because it talks about the problems of absolute authority within a sovereignty state. What happens when a sovereignty state that has absolute authority misuses their power? The example that we have from the author is what happened during World War II, and of course with Germany and the Jews and the Jewish citizens and the great Holocaust that occurred. One could argue that Hitler and Germany had a right to do what they did, that Nazis had a right to do what they did at the time, because they had absolute authority and sovereignty, therefore that they were above the law and could enact the law in any way they saw fit. And of course, the world went up in arms with this. And after World War II, the United Nations got together and kind of pounded out this idea, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was signed by almost all nation states, not all, but I think most nation states have now signed the document itself. The document covers over 30 separate rights for individuals, and although this is not a legally binding document, meaning that there are no laws that absolutely require the signing states to follow the document, in today's world, we have actually allowed for the practice of military enforcement under certain circumstances. And as our nation's history has shown globally, enforcement whenever it is felt that certain nations are actually not following their agreed upon human rights of individual citizens, the United States and other nations have stepped in order to force that nation state to follow certain rules. So at what point in time do we lose our absolute authority and our legitimate authority in order to have absolute sovereignty over a geographic location? This becomes a really important question, especially when we are looking at nation states, which in general are now on the verge of being critically viewed by other nation states within the United Nations. So that would include, for example, North Korea. It would include right now states such as Iraq and Iran. So you'll want to consider these important elements as you write your own paper.